Hey, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and I'm here with another lesson in air power, and that is about armor and fuel tank protection in World War II and the surprising lack of it as the war starts. That is not just limited to Japanese aviation. So the aim of this video is basically two things. Explain the reasons why barely any nation had aircraft armor or fuel tank protection going into World War II, and then also discuss some of the technical challenges that come with adding that sort of protection to the aircraft and the trade-offs you really have to take into account there as well. I'm going to talk about this with the historic backdrop of World War I summed up in the initial part of the video. Then I'm going to talk about the interwar years, and then we're going to go into World War II with a couple of case studies using German, British, as well as American aircraft. And now you may say, hang on, why don't I talk about like Soviet aircraft? Didn't they have a specialized armored aircraft like the IL-2? Well, yes, the Germans also had something similar with the Hangzhou 129, but those are really specialized aircraft that are almost built because of armor or because of the benefits that the armor provides that was specified directly with the design and not something that was added later on. So it's a completely different type of bird, and it's an exception rather than the rule. And I also won't talk about the Japanese, except touch upon them at the very end of this video, because I'm going to do that in a longer episode dedicated only to Japanese aviation with Justin Pike in our Japanese Air Power series, because there's lots of learnings there. And really, this idea that we have that the Japanese, that they didn't want to armor or they didn't want to add some sort of protective measures to the aircraft is false. And I think some of the reasons that I'm going to talk about with Britain, Germany, and America are already going to highlight why that might be. I'm also not going to talk about this whole survivorship bias. You may know this picture right here. Because I've made a video 7 years ago about that, so you can watch that, you don't have to, but it would make me happy. And also, it's well known, I think, to you as an aviation geek audience. You know this stuff, right? Yeah. So, World War I, let's talk about the Great War. It's the first war that you see concentrated use of aircraft. You have some armed aircraft that are already being used by some nations like Italy or the United States previously to that, but really World War I is the one where military aviation comes in big time with reconnaissance aircraft, fighter aircraft, bomber aircraft, and also ground attack aircraft, which is going to be important in just a second. And as you're adding machine guns to aircraft in order to shoot at the ground or at other aircraft, so too are weapons used to shoot at aircraft, either from the air to air as defensive weaponry, or on the ground with machine guns or early versions of AA guns being used there. And there is definitely a discussion about aircraft survivability as well as pilot survivability that already comes out of the Great War. You may know about this dispute that certain air forces have about parachutes. Some air forces, although they weren't really air forces at the time, but some air forces used parachutes at the very end of the war. The Germans were one of them, and some stalled the introduction of those because of various reasons. The RAF is one of those. One of the reasons that is often given is that certain people thought that a pilot with a parachute won't fight as hard as a pilot without a parachute. I can see that in the context of the time being one of the arguments that was leveled, but I'm not quite convinced just yet that that is the single most deciding reason. I think the failure rate of these parachutes is something that has to be considered, because there is estimations that at this point in time about a third of the parachutes fail. So this was, still something new that was being developed, and just because you jump out with a parachute doesn't mean that you won't have a very violent earth to human interface as you're descending in terminal velocity. But the reasons about aircraft protection really come with these aircraft being exceptionally lightly constructed. All you have is wood and canvas covering, or in some aircraft, like for example the Albatros or the Rolands, you're starting to have wooden coverings or metal coverings, but these aren't really to the point where a bullet hitting them won't penetrate. At certain angles, yes, there might be less penetrations, the bullet starts to tumble and so on, but really if an aircraft is shooting at you from behind, it is reasonably possible that if it hits the aircraft, it may also hit the pilot. So a lot of pilots were just killed outright by machine guns fired from the rear or from the front as they were attacking a bomber. And then, of course, there is absolutely no protection to the fuel tanks. So fuel leaks were very common. And if you add fuel with oxygen, a little spark, some incendiary rounds, and poof, of course, these aircraft, because they were so lightly constructed, lots of fabric, lots of wood, were also vulnerable to fire, even as you started to impregnate fabric with anti-flame retardant materials. But nevertheless, that was really only stopping the spread of fire from erupting immediately, and maybe you just had enough time to land and get out. But most of the cases, if an aircraft in World War I was on fire, the pilot was doomed. Which is, of course, one of the reasons why they often also equip themselves with pistols. But the main problem is not just technological, but it's also weight and the performance of these aircraft. Let's take a aircraft, one of my favorite aircraft from that time, the SPAD 13. It's a French plane. It was also then taken over by the Americans. Very, very powerful machine. 220 horsepower under the hood for an empty weight of around about 550 kilograms, right? As we go to gross weight or combat weight, we go to 800 kilograms. So you have a thrust to weight ratio, a very simple thrust to weight ratio of 0.4 to 0.275 on this machine. Let's assume that you add some armor to that. That goes up to 50 kilograms. Well, that thrust to weight ratio is going to fall accordingly, and suddenly you're less maneuverable, you're more sluggish, you don't accelerate as fast, you don't climb as fast. And in a industrial technological race where each side is trying to outdo the other in terms of performance, that can very quickly lead to problems. And it also goes into the discussion of how much armor do you actually have to add to these aircraft in order to increase the survivability of them? Do you concentrate on protecting the pilot because that person is the critical element in everything? Or because of the fuel tank problems with leaking fuel tanks or fire risk, do you protect the engine and the fuel tank, or do you protect everything? But of course, if you protect everything, you don't protect anything either because of that weight problem, right? Looking at twin-seaters as well. So the typical sort of reconnaissance / light bombing or even heavy fighter aircraft of this time. Again, the horsepower taps out roughly 220 horsepower, but the weight goes up because it's a bigger aircraft and it has more crew, it has a defensive gun, and all of that is going to add things. So an empty one of these aircraft would stand maybe at 900 kilograms, and once you start fully loading it up, it stands at, well, 1,200, maybe even more kilograms to that, depending on how many bombs you want to take with you and so on as well. Let's just keep with combat weight or without actually having anything loaded. It's probably 300, maybe 400 kilograms extra to empty weight. So you have a thrust to weight ratio which is already significantly less to a fighter aircraft, starting at say 0.22, but it goes all the way down to 0.16. And if you again add additional armor to that, let's say 100 kilograms once, because now you have to protect two positions, then you're sitting at 0.15. And I know thrust to weight ratio is a very complex calculation. I'm just doing sort of dry horsepower to dry weight here. But that gives you an idea of how weight influences that performance that the engine affords. That is not to say that we do not see some experimentation with this. And you may know of a German aircraft, the Junkers J1, which was used by the Schlachtstaffeln. So specialized units that were used for close air support, either strafing trench lines or attacking specific points that were close to the front lines with machine guns or bombs. Now the Junkers J1, which the Germans used in their Schlachtstaffeln, as I said, was a specifically, this is just a good book to have on the German Schlachtstaffeln, although it doesn't say that much about the J1. This was a metal construction, which was relatively rare at the time. So the Germans had the Roland as well that did that, and there's some other countries that experimented with this as well. But you have a pilot, you have a gunner, you have the engine, you have the fuel tank, and all of that is protected by armor. Roughly 5 millimeter, it averages out. It tapers off to become a bit thinner or thicker, depending on where you look at, somewhere between sort of 3 to 6 millimeters. But this was just enough to protect the frontal section of the aircraft, where the engine, the fuel tank, and of course the crew members are. And if you look at pictures of that aircraft, you see exactly where it cuts off. And what this is meant to do is, as this aircraft comes in for a strafe, either with the front guns or with the gunner lowering his machine gun to either side and strafing a trench line perpendicular, or in parallel, in fact, that could also work. Or if you're going to drop bombs, you of course have return fire by rifle caliber rounds that are fired by, well, rifles or by machine guns or something bigger than that. Now, bigger than that, than a rifle caliber round, you're not going to protect it yourself from. But that 5 millimeters, give or take, was just enough that as you consider that the bullets lose a lot of their velocity traveling upwards, probably hit at a really, really steep angle, unless you're going straight over it and they have a perpendicular 90-degree angle. That armor is just enough to afford some sort of survivability to the critical components of the aircraft. Now, imagine or guess how heavy that was. Remember, a two-seater at a time, for, if it's not loaded with bombs or something, just pure combat weight, tops out at, let's say, 1,200 kilograms, plus or minus. So the armor on the Junkers J1 reportedly was 470 kilograms. And in fact, it makes up 25% of the aircraft's total weight. Yeah, thrust to weight ratio is like 0.1. It's a really sluggish machine. Now you can say it went overboard. The Germans went overboard again. Absolutely. But that gives you an idea of how much armor you have to add to have a modicum of protection against the most common rounds that are going to be fired at you. That shows you why it's so difficult to actually get into aircraft protection, and the whole discussion about how much armor do you put on there and what is the price that you're paying for it. Now, moving on then into the interwar period, we have to break this down into the civilian and the military dimension. And the reason for that is similar, one feeds into the other. The interwar period is the golden age of aviation. You have a magnificent boom with aviation in terms of passenger flights and postal services. All of that is, or not all of that, a lot of that is being transferred to aviation, with the first, airlines being set up, flying from one part of the country to the next. Mail services suddenly become almost instantaneous for the time, where you send off one letter in one part of the country and within 48 hours it might arrive in the other part of the country, whereas previously that had taken days, if not weeks, depending on which country you're in. It really presents an explosion of instantaneous passenger or cargo delivery. Near instantaneous. Not at the same volume as trains, of course, because trains are just so much better at transporting cargo and people, but you get speed. Now, the problem is, of course, that civilians don't like it if the stuff they're using is unsafe, and I, as a civilian, very much agree. So the golden age of aviation, as you're starting to have all these airlines and all these new aircraft, and a lot of them are still very experimental, you're getting a safety record that is incredibly sketchy. And a lot of that has to do with fuel tanks. So you have metal fuel tanks at the time that, depending on where they're located in an aircraft, and because just with time and the materials that are being used and the seals, as well as the sort of lines that go into it, they shear, they break, they deform, and so on and so forth as these aircraft are landing, and so on and so forth. So what you're starting to get are fuel leaks, and if you have a fuel leak or build-up of fuel vapor, you only have to add oxygen. Well, that's all around us, and then you just need to add a spark, and that's not good. Problematic are sort of electrical systems that produce sparks, or of course the actual engine. There, something goes wrong, there's a fuel leakage near the engine, there's a buildup of heat, and suddenly it goes up. And then there's of course also the question of crashes. So an aircraft comes in for a landing, maybe crashes. Safety records back then, again, gears not being as solidly constructed as they maybe should be, maintenance not being as good as it maybe should be. Something happens, the plane crashes, people are hurt. But where people then are really hurt or even die off is fire erupts from this wreckage, and you can't get out in time. So with that consideration, there is now a movement to develop some sort of material that you can wrap around the fuel tank in order to prevent it from leaking. And they're starting to use fabrics here. They're starting to use rubber as well, because if an untreated, sort of natural rubber, as it is known, is in contact with fuel, it starts to swell up. And if you then have, let's say, the metal tank and a covering wrapping of fabric, then some rubber, and then another covering wrapping of fabric, if there is a shear in the tank, or there's just a loose connection somewhere with the fuel lines, that fuel will start leaking under the initial fabric or into the fabric, and then it hits the rubber, and the rubber starts swelling up and becomes more or less impregnable. And the fuel, more or less, there's always a little bit of leakage around, but the amount of fuel that is leaked out of all of this wrapping is incredibly limited. And that prevents some of the accidents that were more common at the time. However, we are already going towards the trailing edge of the interwar period here, where this is becoming more common. Of course, there is a problem that as a force acts against the tank, because it's a metal tank, it deforms, and it may also crack or rip open the fabric, the covering fabric, at which point actually it doesn't work anymore. So this is not a silver bullet, this is not a golden ticket, but it at least helps with some of the cases there. And of course, the military looks at this and says, well, that's very interesting. We could use some of that. But they're very slow in adopting it, because there is no immediate need for them to adopt it. And it also comes with a price point attached, not just like the dollar value that you have to then pay to buy these wrappings on the tanks, but there's also some trade-offs that I'm going to be talking about just now. One of the trade-offs is weight. A protected tank weighs more than an unprotected tank. Now, the weight is not as important when it comes to bombers, because bombers have basically performance to spare, or rather the performance is not that important as with fighters. Fighters, however, if you're starting to increase the weight of the fuel tank because of those wrappings, well, they're going to start feeling that in terms of performance. Also considering that, of course, during the interwar period, the fighters were generally a generation behind the bombers in terms of technical development, because everything was focused on bombers and fighters just didn't have that same importance, and that only really reverses that sort of technological parity that was achieved during World War II between bombers and fighters. That only comes out with the experiences of World War II and the onset of high-performance aircraft. Remember, as World War II starts, a lot of nations are still using biplanes in some of their theaters or as part of their whole force. So that is one issue, weight. The other issue is space. A fighter is usually built as small as you can make it for performance reasons, again weight and also aerodynamic reasons at the time, depending on how far advanced your aerodynamic studies were. But also the bombers, just because of the token of being a bigger aircraft, they have fuel tanks in multiple areas. You have more space to play with. And as the bomber was the most important aircraft in the interwar period, bar none, it made sense to invest a bit more in their protection, because you knew that while there is the adage of the bomber will never go through, everybody understood they will lose some bombers. The bombers was just seen as the most effective means to an end for an air force, rather than being invincible. That's what that appropriated meaning of that saying actually means, because the saying was actually developed by Stanley Baldwin, and 1932 was his parliamentary speech as a warning, as a call for disarmament. This was initially meant to get people to, or get countries to not build as many bombers, and it then only became picked up later by the bomber aficionados in each air force saying, yeah, our bombers will get through. That was not the original meaning. Okay, so that's fuel tanks. So fuel tanks are starting to be added towards the end of the interwar period, going sort of into 1937 to 1939 to military aircraft, but it's the bombers that get it, not the fighters. Now armor is interesting, because of course armor is only needed if somebody is shooting at you, and that's why the civilian market doesn't need it. There is nothing going to impact your aircraft from an external force, except if you count bird strikes, but you don't need armor for that. So there is no armor being added to civilian planes, and there is also very little only armor added to bomber aircraft or to fighter aircraft. For fighter aircraft, not at all, in fact. There are going to be some experiments where we'll go into the individual case studies, but the bombers and the fighters really are, I would say, a generation step behind the fuel tank protection that is being added in this element as well. And a lot of this has to do with the fact of, okay, you want to add armor, but what are you adding it to? If you have a fighter, you can say, well, we have the critical systems of engine, fuel tank, and pilot, so we need to focus around that. But with a bomber, it's a large aircraft. And while fuel tanks, you had the benefit with fuel tanks because it's a large aircraft and you have some performance to spare, you can add fuel tank protection relatively easily because the capacity of the tanks and the space where the tank is built more or less allows that. More on that later. With armor, you suddenly have to armor not just critical systems, but you have to armor the pilot seat, maybe the co-pilot seat, the gunner, the second gunner, the third gunner, depending on how big the bomber are. Are you building an armored bulkhead? Are you putting something around the bombs? What are you doing? So suddenly you're just racking up the kilograms or the pounds if you're going Imperial. And against what caliber? Against what caliber? You're not going to be able to stop any sort of significant round fired from an anti-aircraft gun, whether that's 20 mil over to an 88. But there is a discussion to be had about rifle caliber, 50 cal, and potentially shrapnel from explosive rounds from 20 millimeter rounds that are fired by aircraft. But depending on what armor or what you want to protect yourself against, you have to increase the thickness of the armor, and that increases the weight of the armor. So yeah, you have a trade-off, and you have to really think carefully about where are you going to armor the aircraft, what critical systems are you going to armoring, and against what threat. And that takes some time to establish. And in fact, talking about that time that it takes to establish, let's now go over the early World War II period. Now, as that happens, very few planes actually have protective measures that are, and those that do are mainly concerned with fuel tanks. Let's talk about, for example, the Germans. The Germans probably have the most standardized fuel tank protection in their bomber force in the early start of the war, because they're already putting fuel tank protection or protective fuel tanks, mainly with that sort of wrapping that I talked about earlier, into the Ju-86 fleet, into the Dornier 17 fleet, and also into the Heinkel 111s. All of those early versions have protected fuel tanks, which are basically tanned leather, a layer of natural rubber, and then a fabric or a tanned leather above that again. The Bf-110B also has it, and any sort of additional fuel tanks that are also, for example, added to the HE-111 to increase its range, I believe that was specifically with the H4 variant, is also already providing it with some sort of fuel tank protection in that sense. So while we know that there is standardized fuel tank protection at this point, that is not the case with armor. Armor is standardized by industry for the Germans, for the bomber fleet, around the mid-1940s as new variants of bombers come out. So specifically with the Heinkel 111 fleet, that is the H5 variant where we see the standardization. Now it does exist before that, we know this because we have photographic evidence from certain Luftwaffe manuals. We also have photographic evidence from aircraft that flew at the time, and we have reports from the units that use these bombers, as well as any sort of country that shut them down, that then analyzed it. So for example, in May 1940, there's a Heinkel 111 that is shot down over Britain, and the Brits look at it and say, hey, we found a large armored bulkhead towards the rear of the central fuselage, as well as two unidentified pieces of armor as well. We're not quite sure where they fit into. The Germans are adding armor to their bombers. But it really only starts appearing in the bill of materials for the production Heinkel 111s in the mid-1940s. So if I go, for example, through my bill of materials for the Heinkel 111 in 1939, I don't find armor. But I know that it existed because I have other documents that tell me that it existed, right? So for example, with the H4 variant, there are aircraft where in the bill of materials, I find a combined armored weight of 220 kilograms with the pilot seat as well as the gunner positions being protected. I don't find the armored bulkhead, mind you, in the bill of materials or in the weight listing of the additional equipment that could be mounted into the H4. So armor here, we can see, was being added by 1940, early 1942, the German bomber fleet, but it was added as field modification kits rather than being standardized by industry, which had already happened with fuel tanks. One interesting aspect about, by the way, that RAF report with the Heinkel 111 and also the German experience during the Battle of Britain is that if a fighter attacks the Heinkel 111 from straight 6 o'clock at Coalt, because of the conical shape of the Heinkel, the bullets, depending on how they're converging and so on, hit or strike the fuselage and then bounce off, because they strike at such a shallow angle that a fighter sitting straight on the six of a bomber could just fire and fire and fire, and these bullets were started to ricochet off. Of course, some would penetrate and then tumble and maybe do some damage somewhere here and there, but vital components were really not at danger there. And that is one of the learnings that the RAF has during the Battle of Britain, is that only because they have 8 machine guns on their fighters is that they actually stand a reasonable chance of shooting down Luftwaffe bombers, and by telling their crews to specifically focus on shooting the wings, because the Germans have not armored their engines and because you're starting to hit fuel tanks as well. Whereas the Germans, of course, have a similar experience, but from the reverse side, where they say like, oh, our Heinkels and even our Ju-87 Stukas are coming back with a lot of bullet holes. Look at them, they're really, really solidly built. It's really interesting to read these sort of reports. But I know a lot of you like fighters, and as a lot of you have also flown in simulators, you may know a little bit more about the defensive capabilities or the defensive measures built into the 109 fleet. The standardization starts coming in with the E4 model. Before that, just like with the bomber fleet, you have field kits that were issued, and the 109 is a really cool case study to talk about how difficult it is actually in retrospect to add armor to an aircraft, or in fact fuel tank protection. Now initially with the fuel tank protection that comes in with the E4, this can also be refitted or retrofitted to earlier versions. You have once again that sort of rigid tank with the wrapping around it that is meant to prevent some sort of leakages. But here the L shape is actually a problem. The L shape of the 109's fuel tank sits below the pilot, who sort of sits like this on top of it. Obviously there's a seat and there's some compartmental separation between those two, but they basically sit in the more or less same area of the aircraft. And as that comes in, wrapping that is a bit difficult, but really what the military also starts doing, and this is in all countries, it starts going to the tire industry to talk about how can you shape rubber or non-metal materials into shapes that are then used as fuel tanks. And the Germans, with the development of the bladder tank of the 109, I'll have a picture up right now for a later version. I think this is either from the F or the G manual. It starts developing this non-rigid or non-metal fuel tank, which is made out of different materials, amongst them also a lot of rubber. And the fuel tank protection is incorporated into that design. Now that creates some sort of advantages. So if there is a force acting upon the tank, there's less risk of the whole tank deforming, and with that shearing away the fabric and the covering. But it also comes with a weight increase. For the 109, from the E model to the G model, there's a weight increase of 30 kilos. So the fuel tank empty weighs 30 kilos in the E model, 60 kilos in the G model, with no capacity change, mind you. Which, actually, capacity change, that's an interesting point that I will pick up when I talk about the American aircraft. So there is that, right? So, and then shaping that tank in that sort of shape is a bit tricky, but you got it done in the end, at least the Germans did. But let's talk about an armor. Now, some of you, again, with that simulator experience or with having looked at these designs in the past, will know about the back armor and so on and how it restricted vision towards the rear. And you all know that bulletproof windscreen protection. Now, some of the stuff can be added relatively easily. For example, the windscreen protection, it's just mounted in front of the actual windscreen of the 109, and then it's able to absorb most rifle caliber bullets. However, that is a modification kit, and it only starts being really supplied on a 109 natively with the E4 model, and then later on you still see 109Fs and so on where this is basically added in the factory on top of it or sent out as a field kit, whereas it's only with the G model that really starts being standardized in the canopy itself. And the armored headrest, as well as the armored bulkhead behind the pilot and behind the fuel tank, are also added only procedurally throughout these aircraft variants, and it's really hard to pinpoint exactly when this starts happening. I have a lot of books on the 109s. They always say, you know, oh, it starts with the E4, or this was added with, you know, an earlier E model or an F model. But they don't cite exactly the source where that's coming from. And as I'm going through all the different manuals of the 109 versions, sometimes I run into this example where I'm just like, well, it's not in the bill of materials and it's not being explained in the manual itself of how to install these things and how to deinstall. Everything else is being installed, but the armor part isn't. That's a bit weird. So I'm just wondering, is there like an additional manual that was issued that was not part of the aviation or the aircraft manual series? Or was this just something that was so, you know, maybe supplied in a crate with a separate manual inside that crate of how it's being installed, or was it so obvious? Who knows? Anyway, with the F model and the G model, that is no longer the case, but with the E model, you're still starting to see these sort of issues. But I talked about the fuel tank being a bit of an issue of how to install that inside the aircraft, but the back armor is really interesting. So the 109 has two back armors, actually three if you think about it. It has an armored bulkhead that sits behind the fuel tank that is meant to protect the fuel tank, or at least meant to take the most of the kinetic force of a round that penetrates the shell of the 109, then hits this armored bulkhead and then penetrates further towards the fuel tank. So that is supposed to protect that. But behind that, or rather in front of the fuel tank, where the pilot sits, you have the headrest, protects their head, and you have armor plates that are mounted behind the seat. Now, this is actually interesting because the 109, you cannot mount the armor directly behind the seat because the seat is shaped in such a way that there is this groove or this indentation in it. It sort of shapes backwards because that's where the lifeboat goes. And it is covered then with a very thin sheet of plywood, which the pilot just takes out and then takes the lifeboat, throws it into the water as it expands, and then jumps inside. That's at least the theory. So you cannot integrate the armor into the seat, and you cannot integrate the armor right behind the seat because the seat takes extra space, right? So what they do is that separation between the fuel tank compartment and the cockpit, they start adding armor to that, but on the side of the fuel tank, which means that you can only add and install or deinstall this armor if the fuel tank is removed from the plane. No, that's just sort of design trade-offs that you sometimes have to take. And as of course then we're going through the different variants of the 109, the E, the F, and the G, you're starting to see more standardization on this armor being added by the factories rather than as field modification kits. And the same thing is can be said about the modification kits for some of the Yabos, so the fighter bomber variants of the 109s that have received some sort of armor on the bottom of the fuselage to protect vital systems from firing from rifle caliber bullets that are fired from below. However, it is really interesting to see that some of the stuff is not added. So for example, the armored bulkhead that is supposedly added with the 109E behind the fuel tank, I cannot find it in the 109F's 1941 bill of material. If somebody has found it in a manual, please send it my way. I've gone through them multiple times now, and it's always possible that, you know, I'm an only human. I maybe haven't found it, but it's not in the bill of materials, and that's kind of saying something, since it is in the bill of materials of the 1942 G model. So yeah, interesting stuff. Britain, let's talk about Britain. So Britain also shows some advancements in the interwar period. So for example, the Ferry Battle, which was an aircraft that was assumed to take a lot of ground fire, starts getting covered fuel tanks. The Blenheims in 1940 already have some sort of armor to protect the pilot as well. I would say, generally looking at these designs, they are a little bit behind on the curve when it comes to protecting their bombers or their bomber fleet. However, and you also see this because the early 110s and the early bombers that the Brits shoot down over Norway, they uninstall the fuel tanks that they find in those German planes and take them home to test them, saying, hey, this is actually stuff that we don't have and we really have to like look at that. And then once they're done, they're sending that over to the Americans, and the Americans have a look at that. But we will get to the Americans in just a minute. So they are slightly behind the curve when it comes to integrating this sort of protection on bombers. But I would say that they will be slightly ahead of the curve when it comes to integrating the stuff with the fighters. Because while the Germans are starting to integrate this armor with the combat experience, specifically coming, you know, out of 1939 going into 1940, and in preparation of the Battle of France, where not every single 109 has armor, mind you, the Brits already starting field modification kits in May 1940 to protect parts of their aircraft, and they are standardizing more rapidly in terms of industry and supplying this already natively into the machine. And that is the biggest difference between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe keeps on issuing field modification kits, and the standardization in the factory is just trailing behind that, what we find in Britain. So looking at the Spitfire here, you may know this image, which shows all the different armor layers and protection layers of the Spitfire. But that gives you a wrong impression of the trajectory of the Spitfire coming out of the interwar period into the 1940s, because this is how it looked like at the end of the war. Someone is at the door. Right, that was the ECP guy, for those of you who were wondering. Where was I? Spitfire, 1939, 1940, windscreen, right? Yeah. So in May 1940, the windscreen is sent to the squadrons, and there's a famous story about number 92 squadron, yes, with Stanford Tuck, who was, I believe, the commanding officer of the squadron at that point. Famous ace. And he is saved on the very day that this windscreen is added to his Spitfire by that armored windscreen. Yeah, so a German bullet hits it, would have gone through right into his face if it hadn't been for that armor. And that is one of the primary reasons, as that happens more and more along many pilots, why there is no longer that much institutional resistance to adding armor to aircraft. Because at the start of the war, there still was. There were still a lot of pilots and some higher ranking members of air forces as well who were arguing that armor adds weight and that decreases the performance, and that actually is then in turn resulting in the planes shot down. Whereas this early war experience shows that actually a lot of pilots do come back when armor is added, and what you really want to do, especially as both sides are starting to armoring their aircraft, you want to find the correct balance for each aircraft in that regard. And this is a good example. At the same time, in spring 1940, we also have the same thing that happens to the 109s with the wrapping on the fuel tank. However, here again, one of those design elements of the Spitfire, just like with the 109, complicates matters, right? So you have two fuel tanks in the Spitfire. You have the lower one, 37 gallons, and you have the upper one has something 40 gallons, right? The upper one, because it's integral basically into the fuselage's construction and fits flush with the covering plate, either you decrease the capacity of that tank to add some sort of wrapping which would expand its volume, or you don't do that at all. And what the Spitfire does, this covering plate is changed to the deflecting plate which is slightly thicker than all the other sort of metal covering of the Spitfire, in order to then, as bullets come in at a shallow angle from the front, deflect away, and that way the fuel tank is protected. However, the lower tank, where that is not possible, that does receive some Linotex wrapping, which is exactly the same sort of type of wrapping that we see in the early protected fuel tanks of the Germans. June 1940 also have the protection, the armor protection for the glycol tank that's up front, just behind the propeller hub being added. And actually, you remember how I said that the RAF standardizes a bit earlier than the Germans on the armor and the fuel tank protection that is added in the factory line. Well, that is still happening with a version change of the Spitfire, namely with the Mark 1 to the Mark 2. So the Mark 1 Spitfire manual from June 1940 says the following, quote, "On later aeroplanes, armor plate is fitted forward of the fuel tanks and provisions is made for fitting it behind the seat. A plate of extra thick perspex is fitted on the windscreen to render it bulletproof." Okay, so that means that on the later Spitfires that are coming out of the production lines, you have that armor plate forward of the fuel tank, and it is possible, because there's a provision, that it can be mounted behind the seat, but that is not necessarily a guarantee. So you see in the way that they phrase this, it actually tells us in June 1940, as is manual written, the state of the Spitfire Mark 1, whereas that windscreen, of course, that has become standardized very quickly there. Also, this bulkhead in front of the fuel tank, what that is a thin sheet of metal, then asbestos, and then another thin sheet of metal. And on the upper side of that is an armored plate that protects the upper fuel tank, which is again done because the upper fuel tank cannot be protected otherwise with a wrapping, Linotex wrapping or so on and so forth. So you have that plus the covering plate on top of it that protect that. However, 1 month later in the Spitfire Mark II version, you have, open quote, "sheets of armor plate are fitted on the back of the pilot seat and on the fuselage frame behind the pilot seat. A panel of extra thick glass is fitted on the windscreen to render it bulletproof. The lower fuel tank is covered with self-sealing rubber," end quote. So there you can see from the Mark I to the Mark II that the pilot's armor is now no longer provision for it, but it is in fact added at the factory. And this is basically at the same time, June, July 1940, and it's just a change from the Spitfire Mark I to the Spitfire Mark II, where this becomes standardized in the industry. And I would say this is ahead of the Germans, keeping in mind that anything that is added by the industry usually sort of appears on the front lines a couple of months later. I think in December 1941, then also for the Spitfire, there's some extra armor that is added underneath the pilot seat, and so forth. But what I find really interesting with the Spitfire is, as you look sort of as armor is added to this, you're really starting to notice something. And that is not just that they have, of course, identified the exact same systems as every other country would identify as being critical, namely that being the engine or its cooling, the fuel tanks and the pilot, but the RAF has a focus on armoring the front section of the aircraft in front of the pilot, and it's only after that that pilot armor is added to the rear. And what does that tell you? That tells you that they're, of course, flying mainly bomber interception, because you expect the fire to come from the front, from defensive gunners, rather than from behind. And that it's a very sort of offensive outlook, that you expect that the plane's performance, the Spitfire performance, same thing can more or less be said about the Hurricanes, by the way, that will save it when attacked by fighters, so that is not required. Of course, they, as much as everybody else, realizes that most of the time when you're shot down, you actually don't know what hit you, so having that saving throw with an armor plate behind the pilot is probably quite good to have, and you don't want to lose pilots, left, right, and center. You can't afford that from a sustainment standpoint. So protecting them as well is very important. But I found that quite interesting. And as we then also look at the trajectory that the RAF has, going from rifle caliber bullets to then mainly incorporating cannons for the offensive punch, that also is reinforced by the Battle of Britain experience. Now, cannons are being experimented with on the Spitfire already by the time of the Battle of Britain. Doesn't really work out. There are only a few cannon birds actually being equipped, and most of them don't really see any operational usage, because in a few times that they were shooting at German bombers, their guns basically started jamming almost immediately, so it took some time to get the Hispanos working. But the RAF looks at the armor that is being added to German planes and they say, well, the rifle caliber bullets aren't going to cut it. And the 50 cals are probably not going to cut it either. They have sort of that trajectory in mind of where protection is going in the future. And the 50 cal, if at any point in time the RAF considers as more of a stopgap, well, why don't we go to a caliber that for sure you cannot protect yourself unless you want to burden your aircraft with a lot of armor, and that is a 20mm cannon. So that's why the RAF goes for the 20mm. More punch, and you just cannot armor against it. And it's going to guarantee it to be able to take out both fighters and bombers with relative, comparative ease. What's also interesting is that the RAF starts armoring their bombers on their engines. So they have for example, on the Halifax, there is, I believe, a 6mm plate that is added behind the engine of the Halifax to protect it from, again, mainly low caliber rounds. Although I guess it can also soak up some shrapnel if a 20mm high explosive round is being fired by the Germans, which usually, because of the delayed fuse, would explode right at the point of penetration to rip out a large chunk of the aircraft's airfoil. So it's not like an armor penetrating HE round that the RAF uses. Again, that's also in mind with them considering that the Germans will armor their planes. But that 6mm plate is enough for the RAF to provide a modicum of protection to their engines. The Germans generally don't do that. They add a lot less protection to their engine than they would, for example, comparatively speaking, to their crew compartment, which is interesting. Okay, moving over now to the Americans. America, as with everything in World War II, is late to the party, but it does catch up very quickly. And I already mentioned that the British supplied the Americans with German protected fuel tanks, and the Americans looked at this, and having already standardized on the 50 cal, they have a very pessimistic evaluation of protected fuel tanks, because they fire at them with a 50 cal round, and it turns out that a 50 cal round is quite destructive. And especially as they're shooting it at this first generation of protected fuel tanks, which are metal covered tanks, the 50 cal goes in with so much force that the tanks start warping and start ripping open the covering because of that destructive force. It really goes in like a battering ram of a 50 cal. And the Americans look at that and they say, oh my, if we add something like this to our planes, we cannot just armor it or protect it against 30 cal, which is the main requirement for any other nation. No, we need to protect against 50 cal, because we can see that us using that already completely destroys a protected fuel tank. So if anybody else were to use the same caliber, there would be an issue. They understand that going above 50 cal with protecting against 20mm or something is not going to be feasible. But there's a couple of things that contribute to this sort of pessimistic stance that the Americans have on this. And that is that oftentimes they're firing in very clean testing environments where they're shooting at a fuel tank with absolutely no intervening structure from, let's say, 200 yards. And because in reality, a bullet has to first penetrate and punch through an outer layer plus potentially a spar or frame or something in order to then reach a fuel tank, it's losing a lot of its destructive capability. But that is not replicated in these early tests by the Americans. And what that causes is that the Americans are saying, okay, instead of the wrapping that the Europeans are using, which are somewhere between 5 to 15 millimeters of wrapping, we're going to go towards 20 millimeter of wrapping in order to protect it from 50 cal shots. That keeps in mind, of course, also that they're shooting at metal tanks, which I said deform under the pressure of a hit, and not bladder tanks. And it's these bladder tanks that are made of non-metallic material that are a lot more effective at being leak resistant to the metal tanks because of the reasons given. So they go off doing this, And it's really interesting as they're doing that, because they're starting to add certain protections to aircraft, and they're starting to run into the same problems that everybody else has. And that is, if we take a look at the F2A2 Buffalo with its upgrade to the -3, 500 pounds of weight is added, which largely goes down to the protective measures. So one of the tanks becomes self-sealing, and one of the tanks has a CO2 purge system attached to it to try to get as much oxygen out of it, or out of the general area and the fuel lines, as possible, in order to prevent a fire and then maybe a catastrophic detonation of it. And armor is of course being added. And that causes the Buffalo, from being a fairly nimble, agile aircraft, to be very much weighed down. And nations that do not have that same sort of handicap, let's say, in this regard, like the Finns, do a lot better with the Buffalo, of course. And one of the reasons is because the performance at that point in time, when you add so much weight to it, wasn't able to keep up. There's also tactical reasons and some other technical reasons why the Finns, for example, are doing better with the Buffaloes than the Brits are, and the Americans. But that's one of the reasons. But I think one of the things that often is also ignored, especially as we consider the American tanks, because they are much thicker because of that additional 5 to 10 millimeters, depending on which tanks you compare to each other. What happens is that the space that this tank occupies, of course, doesn't change. So you're starting to run into issues where a lot of volume is sacrificed for the protection, and the actual fuel tank capacity goes down. P39 goes from 170 gallons to 120 gallons, which is one of the contributing factors of why the Airacobra is so maligned in the American service, because A, its performance starts to suffer with all the armor and protective measures that are added to it. B, the Americans don't have an early warning system in place yet in the Southeast Pacific, which means that when the Zeros come in, they're always at an altitude advantage. And C, the American Airacobras have basically limited endurance and range in the theater. And that makes them into a point defense aircraft that just doesn't do point defense very well. And really the capacity in some of these tanks, as they're being made self-sealing, drops by about 25 to 30% because of this. The B-25 is another example. You have 912 gallons in the B-25 as it comes out of the factories. Once those tanks are changed to self-sealing tanks, we're down to roughly 700 gallons. That's a 24% reduction in capacity. And you have quite a few aircraft, like the B-24, for example, when they come out initially with the A variant, don't have the self-sealing tanks either. And it's only as 1940 moves into 1942 that really that trajectory that a lot of other nations have already gone through takes hold in America, and there's a certain standardization, of course, with the added benefit of already being able to draw on some of the experience from Allies and the tanks that had been captured there by the Brits. So, for example, there's an interesting quote that was actually published in Richard Dunn's book, Exploding Fuel Tanks, which is a fantastic source on aircraft protection, and you should definitely check it out. I'll link it in the description. But Richard Dunn quoted from the American Aviation Magazine from 1941, saying, quote, "The year 1941 saw these devices," that's the protective fuel tanks, "pass from the realm of experimental airplanes into full-scale mass productions, and airplanes were designed, not redesigned to accommodate them," end quote. And that's really important. Now, this is based on the American experience with this. As I was saying, the Europeans are sort of, at this point, still 1 year ahead of them because they've been fighting for longer. But you have that design stabilization that happens, not just with the protective measures that are put in place with either wrapped or then bladder tanks that have self-sealing properties, or the armor that is added to aircraft as a retrofit, as a field modification, but aircraft are designed in such a way that they incorporate these measures as they're coming off the factory line to start with. So the systems itself that are being added are being standardized, where America basically looks, okay, so that tank, that self-protective measure that self-sealing measure works this way, this one works that way, which one is the best? Okay, so we really don't want the metal tanks that are wrapped, we want the bladder tanks, yes, those are better, let's standardize upon those. Here are the specifications of what they have to be doing, giving that to industry, and then these are starting to roll off the factory lines and are being implemented into aircraft at the design stage rather than later on. And that's really important because, as we know from like the war in the Pacific in 1942, for example, the early modifications are still prone to failure, with Wildcats, for example, having all sorts of problems with their new fuel tanks that are starting to leak because the connection points between the fuel lines and the tanks don't really work with the wrapping. There's spillage, and then when there's spillage, sometimes of course the self-protective wrapping starts to swell, and that starts to deform and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, a tank that has been penetrated and then starts to swell up in order to plug that hole, you can't use that tank again. That's another thing you have to keep in mind, of course. Or you have to completely deconstruct the wrapping if you're still using one of those tanks, plug the hole from the metal tank and then rewrap it or something like that. And to close off here, actually, there's another learning here for ground crews, because they used to use these rigid metal tanks, right? And you can stack them, you can transport them in certain ways, you can handle them in certain ways. As America starts adding bladder tanks to the aircraft, there is quite a few warnings that I see have been published to their troops to let them know how exactly they have to handle them compared to the initial more rigid tanks. And I imagine that this is the same with quite a few nations out there. However, I've only found direct evidence with the Americans on this. And that is to say that when you have a bladder tank, you don't stack them, or you only stack them like maybe one or two on top of each other, right? Because when they're empty, and because they're not rigid, they start sacking, and that starts deforming them, and then maybe different temperature changes, you're in humid environments and so on and so forth. That creates all sort of troubles. And as you're starting to crush, you may be starting to crush some of the ones that are stacked on the bottom of the whole pile. You also don't want to bend them, even though they're not rigid. You're not supposed to sort of bend them as you're transporting them to the aircraft. You're not to lift them at the metal fittings, because that risks of ripping out the metal fitting or causing some sort of disconnection. Or if fluids are somehow found their way through a spillage onto the tank, you have to wipe them off immediately. And that all shows learnings with the ground crew that they weren't used to that at the time, and maybe some bladder tanks got destroyed because of improper use, and there is a certain training element to this as well that has to be taken in mind. So yeah, rounding off the Americans there, moving over to the Japanese. As I said, I want to do this with Justin Pike in a future video because we have so much to talk to. So I'm going to refer to Richard Dunn's excellent book again and have him explain it, because he sums it up best, and I think you've already catched on to this when he says that, quote, "The famous Japanese Type 0 carrier fighter was sent to China in the summer of 1940 for its inauguration in combat. At that time, it lacked pilot armor and protected fuel tanks, just as did the Curtiss P-40 fighter going into service with the US Army and the Grumman F-4F entering service with the US Navy, as well as most Bf-109s, Hawker Hurricanes and Supermarine Spitfires about to engage in bitter combat over Great Britain." End quote. So this whole idea that the Japanese were behind the curve is untrue. And in fact, if you look at the Japanese army, they start adding protective measures quite early on. But because the war in the Pacific is mainly considered out of the perspective of the US Navy versus the Japanese Navy, we only think about the Zeros and we only think about the Bettys. And we forget that there's a whole host of other aircraft, and the two aircraft that everybody focuses on are exactly the ones that are very limited when it comes to protective measures and the sort of trajectory that every other aircraft, including Japanese aircraft, is going in. And as protective measures are being added, we're starting to see the same issue, which is one of the reasons why they're not being added, that being weight problems, range problems, capacity problems for fuel tanks, and so on and so forth. So cliffhanger for the future episode. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about this video. I hope all of you enjoyed it. Add some feedback, add some additional information there, cite your sources. And if you're a Patreon channel member, thank you very much, because you allow me to do additional research in the archives and go through all these manuals and bring this to you. And you, of course, also get early access and Discord access for your contributions. As always, I wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky.